also recognized by World Domain Day as one of the top 10 cyber lawyers. Pavan Duggal is the president of cyberlaws.net. While a practicing advocate, Supreme Court of India, Pavan Duggal has international reputation of being an expert and authority on cyber law and e-commerce law. Now I hand over the floor to the desk, to the guest speakers and moderator, Mr. Pavan Duggal. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Good afternoon. After a sumptuous lunch, we are back and numbers will slightly start trickling in. But clearly, what's happened earlier this week has actually woken all of us into, from our sense of complacency into some action. Why? Because if 57 million records of Uber can be compromised last year, and the world gets to know about it this time, just this week, clearly these are wake-up calls. Cybersecurity gets so important. But the question is, what is the legal frameworks? How do we use law and international cooperation for the purposes of ensuring a more secure, resilient cyberspace? And I think for that, we have this very distinguished panel. It's already been introduced, and I believe let's make it more interactive. So what we will do is, we'll have our first round of interventions or presentations of perspectives by the various thought leaders. And then we would like to open it up for questions, interactions. I think we need to discuss, because we have far more questions than we have answers. But if we start asking questions, I think that's the beginning of a new journey. So without further ado, let me call my first panelist this afternoon, Mr. David Koh, who's the Chief Executive Officer of Cyber Security Agency of Singapore. Thank you, David. Over to you.
All right. Excellent. A very good afternoon to one and all, Mr. Duggal and fellow distinguished panelists. I'm honored to be part of this panel to share Singapore's perspectives on some ways that we can move forward on discussions regarding the norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace at the multilateral level. The scale and proliferation of cyber threats has thrown focus on the need for basic rules of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. Cyber attacks this year, such as the WannaCry and NotPetya, are striking reminders that cyber threats have tremendous impact on ordinary people and enterprises. If such attacks are successful, they could have real-life impact and cause significant disruption to how we live, work, and play. Thankfully, there have been recent initiatives at the international level, such as the Global Conference for Cyberspace, GCCS, the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, GCSC, and the Global Forum for Cyber Expertise, GFCE. This whole alphabet soup of acronyms will help drive the conversation on international cyber norms. Singapore is glad to be an active participant of all these international conversations. Singapore's approach to building a secure and resilient international cyberspace is based on the idea that norms must be firstly well-defined and practical. And next, they must be undergirded by well-coordinated programs of capacity building. And this will facilitate a wide and rigorous adherence to these norms. And thirdly, it must be combined with a robust confidence-building measures to gradually build greater trust in cyberspace, which could then potentially make it conducive for us to develop even more norms. The mutually reinforcing triad of norms discussions, capacity building, and CBMs will result in a virtuous cycle that will enable states to work together to protect our common interests in cyberspace. In this regard, Singapore has been complementing the international efforts and increasing awareness of the UNGGE and its work at the regional ASEAN level. That's the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. We have joined the GFCE, and we are proposing an international IoT security consortium initiative to develop international IoT security standards. And we are proud to be a sponsor of the GCSC. At the regional level, Singapore has leaned forward to facilitate awareness building initiatives and to move the conversation forward on cyber norms through platforms such as the ASEAN Ministerial Conference on Cybersecurity and ASEAN Cyber Capacity Program, ACCP, which was launched by my minister last year in 2016 to the tune of 10 million Singapore dollars to complement ASEAN efforts to build capacity across policy, technical, and operational areas, including norms awareness building and the development of capacity to implement these norms. By design, the ASEAN Cyber Capacity Program is modeled on a 3M line: modular, multidisciplinary, and multi-stakeholder. Through the ACCP, we have hosted an ASEAN Cyber Norms workshop and a regional expert seminar on preserving and enhancing international cyber stability, organized by the United Nations Institute for Disarmament Research, UNIDIR, and the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS. We will also be sponsoring part of the UNODA flagship online training course on the use of ICTs in the context of international security. In the year to come, we'll be continuing to deepen these projects and also identifying ways to work with various other stakeholders, ASEAN dialogue partners like the US and Australia, industry players like Microsoft, academia, and NGOs like UNIDIR, UNODA, and the ICT for Peace Foundation, all to conduct cyber norms awareness workshops in May and August of 2018. Singapore is supportive of the UNGGE's work. Singapore's conviction is that all of this work is undergirded by the work of the United Nations group of governmental experts on the developments in the field of information and telecommunications in the context of international security. That's the UNGGE for short. The UNGGE reports of 2013 and 15 have been key to providing clear bases for understanding the application of international law and the need for the adoption of voluntary cyber norms as a means of building a secure and resilient cyberspace for all. At the same time, the recent UNGGE has failed to come up with a consensus report. So what does this mean for ASEAN and the rest of the world, especially since cyber threats are not going to wait for us while we continue the conversations and develop basic rules for cyber behavior? To secure cyberspace and to develop trust and confidence in the use, we need a rules-based order for cyberspace. A clear consensus on how to engage one another is critical for states to develop the necessary confidence and trust so as to work together effectively on cybersecurity. Singapore has been consistently supportive of the application of international law to cyberspace. We believe that people should enjoy the same rights online as they do offline. But these rights also come responsibilities. Our responsibilities offline should also mirror our online responsibilities. We are also supportive of the adoption of the 11 voluntary norms of cyber behavior set out in the 2015 UNGGE report. At the recent second ASEAN Ministerial Conference on Cybersecurity, hosted by Singapore on the 18th of September 2017, ASEAN ministers and senior officials agreed on the need for ASEAN to adopt voluntary, practical, and operational norms of state behavior in cyberspace, taking reference from the 2015 UNGGE report. This is a significant step. Taken together, the continuing discussions on the application of international law in cyberspace and the implementation of UNGGE voluntary norms of behavior will help to eventually build a rules-based order in cyberspace, an order that will protect and advance the interests of all states, large and small alike. These discussions need to take place both at the regional and international levels. In this regard, Singapore remains firmly committed to and supportive of continuing norms discussions at the UN. The UN provides a key platform for both large and small states to have their views represented and heard. This is an important step in building consensus. All these form a strong foundation for our work ahead. However, we can consider expanding cooperation along 3 lines. Firstly, encouraging interregional cooperation. An area that needs to be looked at is encouraging interregional discussions on the implementation of cyber norms. There are rich resources and ideas residing in groupings like the Organization for American States, OAS, the European Union, EU, and the African Union, which have started discussions on cyber capacity building and cyber norms. Finding ways in which the outcomes from these discussions could be shared with other regional platforms like ASEAN would be beneficial in helping these platforms develop and progress our thinking on our own plans and to move forward. Singapore is ready to host such discussions should the need arise. Such discussions can also complement the discussions that take place at the UN and elsewhere. Another possibility is for like-minded states to work together on capacity building and sharing of best practices. Special interest groups like the Forum of Small States, FOSS, can be very useful in moving forward these conversations, and we are supportive of including NGOs and industry partners in these discussions so as to have a fuller perspective to reach a more concrete conclusion. Lastly, engaging industry and civil society. Cybersecurity is a team sport. No one country or no one agency can do it by themselves. And given that the large percentage of cyber infrastructure, resources, and expertise reside in the hands of the private sector, it is clear that no single stakeholder has all the answers. We must work with industry partners. As the UN Under-Secretary General, Ms. Izumi Nakamitsu, said in a message to the recent Singapore International Cyber Week, a larger space can be made for views from the private sector to be heard and taken aboard. This is so that our joint objectives can be reached more effectively. Singapore looks forward to engaging with industry and civil society in discussions and capacity building efforts. The fact is, we are all in this together. Either way, these interregional, multilateral discussions and multi-stakeholder discussions should feed into the deliberations happening at international fora like the UN. This is where the UN has an important role to play in moving international discussions on cybersecurity issues forward. It is uniquely placed to facilitate a more inclusive and open process. This will further enrich the norms discussions at the international level and accurately reflect the importance of such discussions in the security cyberspace and our global commons. Thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you for your inputs. So Singapore has now started a new chapter. What is this chapter? They are now coming up with a draft cybersecurity law. They opened it up for public comments. The comments have been received. And clearly, when you analyze the cybersecurity law of Singapore, you quickly start realizing that they have taken leapfrogging steps ahead in terms of learning from other legislations across the world and then coming up with the best model, which they think is going to actually be working in the Singapore perspective. So from Singapore, let me take you over to Hungary. Budapest had seen the second GCCS being organized after London, and Budapest and Hungary have been thought leaders. So I'm going to invite Ambassador Károly Dan to actually come and give his perspectives on what should be the way forward for law and also international cooperation for securing cyberspace. Over to you, Dan.
Thank you, and also thank you for inviting me to speak at this conference. It's an honor. Let me first say a few words about the OSCE, because I think it's important for you to know that, what is the international body that I'm talking about, because the work within the OSCE is obviously specified by its by the member states or the participating states that are shaping its policy. The OSCE is a very interesting format that came about in the 1990s. After the fall of the Soviet Union and the many changes, political changes that we saw in Central Europe, including also keeping peace in the Western Balkans, called for an organization that had a certain mandate within Europe, but also it encompasses 57 participating states that include the United States, Canada, now the whole EU, the Western Balkans, the Russian Federation, and also the former Soviet republics in the Caucasus. The reason why the OSCE proved to be very helpful and very efficient in developing CBMs is because we have three areas that are overlapping and that are all relevant to what matter in cybersecurity. The first leg of the OSCE is one in security. The second one is economic cooperation. And the third one is the human dimension. And needless to say, I don't need to explain it here why the overlap of these three areas are key so that we have a normal, or we can keep normalcy and we can keep the order in cyberspace the way so that it's both does not proliferate in one way. On the other hand, it is going to remain as a sphere of normal civic everyday life for the freedom of all of us. So let me turn to no matter how we actually did what we did within the OSCE and what lessons I believe it actually brings for other areas in the world and where we actually, as Mr. Cole already mentioned, started cooperation. So we were focusing on the exchange of information and best practices about issues related to cyberspace and the threats resulting from it. And we believed it was a good start to enhance cooperation and create trust between countries facing the same challenges. In 2012, the OSCE started to work towards reducing risk of unwanted escalation in the political military sphere, as participating states feared that an incident in cyberspace might lead to wider political or even military tensions. The informal working group that I'm chairing on cyber issues was established and tasked with developing and reaching consensus on confidence building measures, or CBMs, to enhance interstate cooperation, transparency, predictability, and stability to reduce the risk of misperception, escalation, and conflict. OSCE participating states have made significant steps in addressing risk by adopting 2 decisions on confidence building measures, 16 altogether by now. The CBMs can be broadly categorized as measures about transparency, allowing states to read another state's posturing in cyberspace. To give you some examples, providing national views on aspects of national and transnational threats to and in the use of ICTs, sharing information, and sharing information on national organization, strategies, policies, and programs relevant to the security of and in the use of ICTs. The other aspect would be measures on communication and cooperation, such as holding consultations in order to reduce the risk of misperception, using the OSCE as a platform for dialogue and exchange of best practices, as well as awareness raising, and also nominating contact points to facilitate communication. This is CBM number 8. And the third aspect of the CBMs would be to promote national preparedness and due diligence to address cyber challenges, which is protect critical national and international ICT infrastructure, modern and effective national legislation to facilitate bilateral cooperation and information exchange, and also providing contact data of existing official national structures that manage ICT-related incidents and coordinate responses. To date, the OSCE remains the only international body which achieved major practical accomplishments related to cyber among participating states, which have in some cases different approaches to cybersecurity. And this is very important to emphasize. States that have very different or differing views on how to address issues in cyberspace. Developing norms, rules, and principles of responsible state behavior was our aim when we started this work. Other regional organizations, like, for example, like it was mentioned, the Asian Regional Forum and the Organization of American States have indicated their intention to develop and implement confidence-building measures as well. As a chair, I'm happy to obviously announce that we will be honored and very glad to help out their work in this respect. The question needs to be addressed why a state should feel bound by any norm, code, or engagement if it does not have the confidence that another state will apply the same principles. This is the underlying question or the underlying issue of everything that we do. If honest brokerage was such a simple issue in cyberspace, all our work would be completely meaningless. Unluckily, this is not the situation. Measures that create the conditions for such frameworks to function in practice, and this is where the CBMs under the OSCE framework come in, are essential to our work. CBMs adopted by the OSCE are closely linked with the work done by the United Nations group of governmental experts on developments in the field of information and tech. Well, I will not read the full title, you obviously know this already. The efforts of the OSCE Informal Working Group build to a large extent on the UNGG reports and focus on finding ways to translate the rules and principles into practical measures. Our aim is to enhance transparency, cooperation, and stability between states in cyberspace through confidence-building measures. And our aim for the future, and this is where I'm going to be a little more elaborate when we sit down and answer questions, is how actually we move on implementing these CBMs, how we develop them as practical measures that states actually will use in times of conflict or in times of emerging tensions to avoid conflicts. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you. Thanks for your inputs. That's lovely. Please have a seat. So I think we've now traveled across the globe. We began from Singapore, we've gone on to Budapest, and from Budapest, let me take you over to the United States. The US has been a thought leader, and they are doing some remarkable work, but it's important to understand what is the US vision in today's transient, turbulent times of how law and international cooperation can be used as a tool for securing cyberspace. Over to you, Robert Stryer.
Thank you, Pavan. Thank you for that lead in. I want to thank the government of India for hosting the GCCS this year. I would note parenthetically that we have a very close relationship, the United States and India, on cyber security issues. Last year, we signed a framework document on our cyber relationship that sets out a number of principles that we're going to continue engaging on going forward, and we hope to host India ICT and cyber dialogue in Washington in the early part of next year. The GCCS was started in 2011, and the goal of the GCCS was to provide a forum for us to discuss a number of issues from development to security to human rights in a forum that engaged so many sorts of different stakeholders and not just governments. Over the years, we've had very frank discussions, and this year is no exception. I thank my panelists today in putting forward some very interesting ideas, and I've heard so many good questions over the forums that I've been able to attend, and I anticipate we're going to get some more great questions today. And I appreciated Pavan's articulation of the issues so far between the panelists as well. So this forum is important because it does provide that multi-stakeholder ground for discussion. And in the area of international cooperation on securing cyberspace, it's particularly important that we have a discussion that's multi-stakeholder, because securing cyberspace should not be dominated by nation states. It's something that nation states certainly have a role in, but to flip the script that we've been following so far in the decades that we've seen in the development of the internet to one that's entirely based on state-dominated rules of the road is something that we shouldn't pursue. We should think about how the internet was developed, if I may, with this crowd that's very sophisticated and is probably well aware. But think back just a few decades, that's all we've had of an internet and a World Wide Web, just in a few decades. And there was no government grand design for how that would develop going forward. It's developed on its own. Government has sort of nurtured and protected and set it the base criteria and elements for the internet to develop, but it wasn't set by a grand design. So today we have billions of people that are connected, people that are communicating, people that are participating in public life, people that are having a say about their country's futures. Indeed, the human rights that they're expressing online are becoming one of the most important human rights issues of our era. And on the economic side, the flow of data across borders has enabled a robust increase in economic development around the globe. It's been realized by the shared prosperity in so many countries. It's led to increases in standards of living for so many people. These are things that we want to foster and see go to another level, levels that we can only imagine or speculate about today. So we don't want to set a path dependency forward where we limit the trajectory of what we're able to achieve. So as I said, there is a role for states. But the states need to recognize that it's limited in what we are able to achieve. There's so many other players in cyberspace. Recently, we've seen disruptive attacks that have been fostered or acknowledged to be part of nation-state regimes. We can work together to create stability in cyberspace as nation-states. We can seek to address common threats and set the prerequisites we need to be able to combat threats and incidents as they occur. In cyber environment, we're facing a number of threats recently, some of those that act outside what we consider traditional norms. So in the United Nations, the group of government experts, we've sought to assert the applicability of international law to cyberspace. We've achieved that through the GGE since 2009 in conclusions that occurred in 2010, 2013, and 2015. In addition to asserting the applicability of international law to cyberspace, we've established voluntary norms of responsible state behavior. In particular, in 2013 and 2015, we established norms such as that nation states should not be part of the attack on critical infrastructure in other countries. In addition to these norms, we can also use confidence building measures as practical measures so that we can understand one another and ensure that we're not misunderstanding each other and causing miscalculations to occur and the potential for escalation to occur in cyberspace. So these are efforts that we can undertake as international actors at the government level. There are so many other activities that can occur in the private sector to ensure security in cyberspace. Let me just comment a little bit on what the United States has been doing recently. Pursuant to President Trump's May executive order on cybersecurity, the State Department is leading other executive branch agencies in creating an international engagement strategy on cyberspace and also a strategy on providing deterrence options to secure cyberspace. With regard to that deterrence strategy, one element is an item that we've been discussing with a number of other countries, and that involves asserting that there should be consequences for states that act outside the norms of responsible state behavior. Those consequences could range from diplomatic to legal to sanctions. We're beginning the discussions on that front, and those are an important way that governments can participate going forward in establishing stability in cyberspace. So that's a key part of our, if you will, the deterrence strategy for the United States. On the international engagement strategy front, there's two items that I want to highlight. The first is that we're prioritizing the importance of having a multi-stakeholder governance structure for the internet. And the second is that we want to establish a global regulatory environment that recognizes the importance of the private sector in regulatory decisions. We see a key interdependency between regulatory decisions and security decisions. As security decisions are made, they influence the technology that's available for the future growth of the internet. And in turn, as that technology develops on a different pathway, it influences what security is available. In sum, I want to say that the United States wants to work with governments, private sector, civil society, and others to secure the internet that we have today and to ensure that it reaches its full potential going forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Robert. That's been wonderful. So we've seen perspectives from three distinctive jurisdictions. These are distinct experts of ours. But having said that, somewhere while we talk about international cooperation, the position of law becomes more important. But where are we standing? I thought let's give you a small glimpse of where currently we are standing this afternoon and what do we need to do going forward. Can we have the presentation, please? I thought I'll just collate certain visuals which have come across, which can actually help us understand in which direction we are currently going forward. Being a student of cyber law, I thought, let me share with my vision. Next slide, please. Next. Okay, so we talked about the Uber data breach. 57 million records breached October 2016, disclosed this week. What fortuitous time, because the time of happening of the GCCS, and now opens up a Pandora's box. The question is, this is a breach of cybersecurity, not just limited to a jurisdiction, but multiple jurisdictions. Very interesting to see how things actually take forward. Next slide. So Korea, we've seen the cryptocurrency exchanger has been attacked. We thought cryptocurrencies were safe. And lo and behold, they have now been attacked and they are under immense pressure. Next slide. British cryptocurrency is also not immune. We've seen Electronium, which has actually been hit by a cyber attack after it's raised a lot of money. So the cyber criminals are very opportunistic, brilliant people who look for opportunities per se. Equifax, it actually engaged so much of our attention the last few weeks. So much breaches happening, impacting the social security numbers and personal information of millions of Americans. And that again brings forward questions that the world has to answer. But if you look at this survey, it tells you that by the time it's going to be 2021, the global cost of cybercrime will exceed $6 trillion US. And I can assure you, those are conservative figures. Actual figures may be far more. Next. So we saw the WannaCry attacks going on to a corporate entity, stopping production and completely paralyzing this particular sector. Next slide. Well, ransomware has been the, shall I say, the jewel in the crown this year. Ransomware has hit 150 countries, WannaCry, and we still do not know the actual losses that the world is capturing. South Korea currently in an emergency mode. Why? Because of the threats to the banks that have emerged in cyberspace per se. Tesco Bank in the UK has not been left untouched. They got their most unprecedented cyber attack that they ever knew. Well, Germany has said, hold on, we are now going to come up with dedicated squads to protect cyber security, apart from coming up with new initiatives in this regard. Well, what's emerging on the landscape today? The first thing is, when I talk of law and international cooperation, there is no international, shall I say, legal frameworks. Next slide. There's lack of international order and treaty in cyberspace. Yes, you have the Budapest Convention, but that is 15 years old. It limited itself to a certain sector of cybercrime regulation. World has moved on, and there's nothing that's yet to come up to supplement the Budapest Initiative. No wonder cybersecurity law has emerged as a very key discipline of cyber law in the last 18 months. And that's something that the world is now looking forward. So what's the first thing that I'm seeing? I'm seeing a land grab as far as cybersecurity legislation is concerned. Countries are coming up with huge legislations, broadly drafted, so that they can actually cover everything that's there on the site. I see that as the Alexander phenomenon. I see, I conquer. That's what's happening in today's legislations. And China has actually demonstrated that its cybersecurity law is going to be applicable to the entire China, to outer space, to the seabed, and to polar regions. So clearly, we are beginning to see that the concept of cyber sovereignty is now constantly being expanded. And a lot of countries want to go in that direction where they can expand their cyber sovereignty definition in broad terms as time passes by. Germany, on the other hand, has said, hold on, we are coming up with only a limited focus on protection of critical information infrastructure per se. Russia, a different approach. Russia says, I believe in data localization. Their law on data localization has actually said, you want to do a business in Russia with Russians, please ensure that the data of Russians is in Russia. So there's complete absence of norms of behavior that's happening at a global level. And that's why I believe the GCCS becomes an important tool in this regard for evolving norms. While we are waiting for the so-called international norms, countries are not waiting. They're going in for bilateral arrangements. These are examples, the US, China, the US, UK, and stuff like that. Internationally, different countries are waking up. So whether it's Papua New Guinea, whether it's Nova Scotia, new laws coming up. Next slide. We see new laws coming in Bahrain, as also in the United Arab Emirates. Next slide. We also see Zimbabwe coming up with a new potential law on cybercrime. And of course, Singapore is happening. But I think norms of behavior will have to be common minimum standards of behavior. which are acceptable to all in this global ecosystem. Because when I look at the evolution of cyber law as a jurisprudence, one realizes there was getting to be some order, and now with this so-called massive cybersecurity paradigm coming in, it's slightly the law of jungle returning. In that ecosystem, I think the world needs a new legal approach to cyberspace. We saw Talon Manual 1, Talon Manual 2.0 coming in, which have given one alternate model of how rules of engagement need to be in cyberspace, both for cyber war and also for activities that go just below the level of cyber war per se. And that's a path-breaking way forward. But of course, it's an academic work subject to a lot of discussion per se. Next. Well, you thought cyberspace is only about terrestrial world. Think again. It's already now exceeding to the outer space because satellites of countries are being taken control of by other state and non-state actors, and cybersecurity assumes a different paradigm altogether. I think the second big thing that I'm seeing is the Internet of Things lawlessness. There's complete lawlessness. Why? 50 billion devices going to be connected to the internet by 2020, and we do not even have security protocols of ensuring basic minimum security in this space. No wonder, I think the Internet of Things will bring across massive cyber legal challenges as we go forward. So, right from getting a refrigerator to attack a network, to using a smart oven to go ahead and send spam email, we are waking up in a new world. And I think law needs to quickly address these challenges if we want a secure cyberspace. No wonder NATO has said that cyber is the next domain of warfare, and we need to be at least alive to that new ground reality. I think today, the situation is cybercrime everywhere, not a place to go. Nobody of us is immune from cybercrime. There's so much of cybercrime happening, and I think we need to address this if we want a secure cyberspace. All kinds of cybercrime, low level, slightly high level, highest level, state, non-state actors. It's a very, very difficult mix per se, but I think mobile crimes are particularly happening in the third world. In countries like India, we are beginning to see massive increase of mobile crimes, which have an impact upon how cybersecurity has to be looked at. So this global cost, I believe, will continuously keep on rising as we go forward. The third important step that I wanted to sensitize you was dealing with the darknet. Nobody in these fora talks about the darknet because it's uncomfortable. But the fact is, darknet is already part of mainstream activities. And if we do not address the mechanisms of how to deal with the attribution problem on the darknet, we will be in bigger trouble. Because with Rifle and being announced and coming, the biggest, most secure darknet that the world has ever known, and its makers have given an open challenge. No law enforcement agency can crack this. Clearly, lawmakers have a huge, humongous challenge in front of them as we go forward. I think another big challenge in this ecosystem is the attribution crisis. How do we attribute a particular act done by a particular actor to the relevant ecosystem and have it proved in a court of law? There's no international norms. There are no international, even acceptable principles in this regard. Clearly, I think norms of behavior has to be the way going forward. And that's why we personally believe that these exercises like the GCCS go a long way in generating international consensus on norms of behavior. But what about artificial intelligence? Hold on. I thought, we were still talking about cyberspace, but this happens to be a new paradigm shift. And with artificial intelligence coming up with new challenges, I think lawmakers are going to be very, very busy if they want to make cyberspace more secure. Well, we have the WhatsApps of the world, which have united the world, but have brought forward new challenges for law enforcement agencies and the governments of the world per se. Cyber terrorism is already no longer on the horizon. It's arrived in your own respective countries, and we do not know how to deal with it. And that also needs to be appropriately dealt with. Cyber radicalization, we thought, was limited to one part of the world. We are mistaken. It's now spreading across. In a country like India, there's so much massive increase of cyber terrorism and cyber radicalization that quickly lawmakers need to look into the same. Robotics has to be the next level, which I think lawmakers have to keep in mind. Clearly, driverless cars were a good beginning, but now that the first accident has been done by a driverless car, lawmakers have to step backwards and say, hold on, to whom are we going to subscribe liability? And how can we use or not use a driverless car for attacking the internet? It's a different world altogether. Next slide. I think blockchains, I personally believe, will be an important challenge for lawmakers if you want to secure an orderly cyberspace. But how do we regulate the blockchains is a big challenge whatsoever. Big data populates cyberspace. Today, cyberspace is built on big data, but we still do not have even universally acceptable norms on big data, shall I say, regulation per se. Whether we like it or not, this is a new trend. The balkanization of the internet is now a ground reality. With countries developing their own artificial net, I think it's time that the lawmakers need to have a more holistic perspective of how to deal with these challenges per se. You thought fake news had no connection with cyberspace? Think again. Fake news is responsible for massive dissemination of malware, spyware across the world, which has a massive impact upon the security of the cyber ecosystem. What are the new rules of norms that are required to be done? I think there's a lot of requirement. I've been talking of a need for an international convention on cyber law and cyber security since the WSIS Forum 2015. But today, the political climate may not appear to be more fertile. So therefore, common denominators need to be the next step going forward. I think common denominators is what the GCCS and other, shall I say, stakeholder meetings need to look at, because these are pragmatic and they will be very, very essential as we evolve the cyber law jurisprudence. I think the fragmented clusters of cyber law development will also have to give rise to more homogenized approaches on law and on securing cyberspace per se. Not running away from the fact that cybersecurity will actually be driving economies, societies, and the law. So the quicker we have that in our consideration, the better. Of course, Internet of Things and artificial intelligence will now need to be important, positive, game-changing elements, paradigms, which we can use in the lawmaking process so as to help make cyberspace more secure. Of course, attribution is still a huge problem. And if we are not going to address this, there is going to be pandemonium across the cyberspace per se. So very quickly, work has to be done in this regard per se, apart from jurisdiction. Internet jurisdiction still continues to be a black hole even after almost 30 years of the coming of the internet. So work needs to come across in this regard per se if we want to secure cyberspace. We have created the International Commission on Cyber Security Law, which is looking at coming up with common denominators and principles governing cybersecurity law and how these principles can be adopted by nations as they go forward regulating cybersecurity. Finally, I think we did a precursor event to this conference. This was the International Conference on Cyber Law, Cybercrime, and Cybersecurity. It's an annual event. This year we had 150 speakers from different parts of the world, 66 nations, and we have 51 different sessions. We came up with an outcome document. I think instrumentalities like these will help contribute in the evolving legal space on making cyberspace more secure. I think finally, I'd just like to say this is where we currently stand. And as a student of law, I'm confused because I want to learn not just from my distinguished panelists, I want to learn from all of you. At this juncture, I'm going to open up the hall. Is there any question? We have a question here. Can we request for some mic? Sir, can we have a mic this side? Sir, can you identify yourself, your name, and to whom you want to ask this particular question? The mic is not working. Can we have the other mic, please?
Hello. I'm sorry to interrupt you. We are right now connected to 2,800 locations all over the world. And we have some questions on the screen from some of the locations. Can we have the look on the questions?
Sure.
Yeah,
I think thank you, ma'am, for informing. By the way, for informing all of you, 2,800 locations across the world are currently joining us live at this particular session. There are questions. We will come on the questions. But before that, we have the first question from the floor. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. My name is Ben Hiller. I work for the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe. Can you hear me?
Can you be a bit loud, please? We cannot hear because of the echo.
You cannot hear. That's unfortunate. Maybe now.
Yeah,
okay.
That's better.
Thank you for organizing this panel, and thank you to the panelists for their presentation. I've got a comment and a specific question. I think one of the key things we need to do when it comes to discussing cyber is to not mix up everything in one. Cybercrime, cybersecurity, cyberterrorism, we cannot deal with everything in one go, and it somehow felt that we tried to do this in the last couple of minutes. I've got a very specific question. The panelists talked about the importance for norms of responsible state behavior, about confidence building measures, about regional efforts, and kind of efforts at the global level at the UN. So I would like to come back to a question: how can we promote interregional dialogue on these issues practically? It's a good idea, but realistically and practically, what can we do to ensure that regional efforts are congruent, that we move all in a similar directions while respecting obviously the needs of our constituents, but nevertheless that we are moving in a similar path? And what concretely can we do, for instance, between the OAS, OSCE, African Union, ASEAN, etc., so that we are cognizant of this global nature of the threat we are facing, and not kind of compartmentalize our efforts regionally?
Thank you. That's a question to the panel. Regionalism, regional consultations. David, you wanted to be the first person to take on?
I'll take a stab at this. Let me clarify about what we mean by interregional efforts. Firstly, we're not talking about each region trying to develop its own set of norms. I don't think regional norms on responsible state behavior make any sense. Cyber, by definition, is not regional, it's global. So you can't have little enclaves of different sets of rules, etc. So the rules that we advocate, taking reference from the 11 norms of voluntary norms of responsible state behavior from the 2015 UNGGRE report. Within ASEAN, what we are talking about is the adoption of these norms. So understanding the state of economic development, the cultural background, etc. of the respective region, it's appropriate for us to have this discussion within the regional grouping. And perhaps in certain states, they are not prepared to move on all 11 norms, but perhaps we could start on 6 or 7 of the norms and adopt them first from a regional perspective. This will require capacity building, understanding, raising awareness of the norms. How we do this, I think then is worth sharing with other regional groupings, the EU, the OAS, the African Union, OSCE, etc. The lessons that we learned from our neck of the woods, I think may not be totally applicable in somewhere else, but I think the methodology, the lessons learned could, with the relevant context, contextualization, be something that could be useful, how it might be applicable in another grouping, and vice versa. The lessons learned in the African Union or the OSCE might equally be applicable for someone like me in ASEAN. I hope this clarifies.
Thank you. I think we have now got some questions from people who are joining us live from 2,800 locations across the world. Let me begin by taking the second question first. And the second question says, can the panel advise if anything like basic real-time cyber filters being discussed / in the works for some standard online activities like identity, social, payments, banking, education, government to citizen, etc., to make cyber living easier than thought? That's a very profound question. Robert, would you want to take a try on that?
I can try. I don't think I fully understand the question, honestly. The filtering, I don't know what that really means. I mean, obviously, there's the private sector developing all kinds of techniques to ensure that the people they're doing business with online are secure. They can be assured that they have the right identity of the person that they're doing business with. I don't really see much of a role for governments in setting this up. We don't want the government to be involved in filtering content. So I think it should be a private sector generated tool. And many companies in the private sector have proliferated their tools for making
Apologies, that was technology showing one more avatar, but thank you for that. Karoy, do you have any specific perspectives yourself?
Well, can you hear me? Yeah. What we do at the OSCE is something that is in nature very different. So the way I'd like to clarify it is, and I think that's why the first question was excellent, is that we do need to separate or customize these issues and deal with them separately. What we do is state-to-state cooperation. It has to be based on serious and established thresholds, on severity schemata, so to speak. Therefore, we are developing templates, and we are going to target certain kind of incidents that happen in cyberspace that require state-to-state communication. The rest, we will leave it to law enforcement, certs, whatever you can think of. But as an international or multilateral body, our focus is how states can cooperate and how we can develop rules of behavior and CBMs so that can transpire to other regions and may become, like David said at the end, somewhat global universal rules.
Thank you. So the panelists are very clear that they do not want states to be going ahead and engaging in cyber filters, but it would be left to the respective industry stakeholders. We have a hand here, sir, and your question.
Thank you. I'm Michael Wama from Canada. I have two questions, one for Mr. Strayer. Mr. Strayer, given the current geopolitical context and the seeming lack of ability to reach understandings on some basic concepts, could you comment on the likelihood of the ability to launch a successful negotiation internationally of any sort of a new treaty? And my question for Mr. Coe is, with respect to some of the issues raised with respect to, for example, big data or IoT, could you comment perhaps on the role of non-legislative approaches, perhaps cooperation in industry or other fora as a way to address some of these questions? Thank you.
Great. Thanks for the question, Michael. Hopefully I won't cause the microphone to do what it did last time. Yeah, as we saw, the GGE in 2017 had 25 nations represented, and they could not come to an agreement on further principles to be implemented. So if you were to try to implement a treaty with more than 190 nations, it would probably be more than impossible to come to a conclusion on that in any type of sophisticated way. I mean, you could probably come with some very base principles, but they would not go beyond where we've already been on the GGEs.
And the second question is to you, David.
Right. Thanks very much, Michael, for the question. I think it's about a non-legislative approach and cooperating with industry on some of the new developments like big data and IoT. We fully agree. I think in any one country, the government can at most take the lead. It has to work collaboratively with other sectors of society, civil society, NGOs, industry, academia. I think in areas like big data, IoT, this is essential. Industry in particular understands the technology. Industry is driving the R&D in these areas. So it's incumbent on us to work collaboratively with industry, how best we can talk about cybersecurity, implement cybersecurity in these areas with industry. It's better to implement cybersecurity from the onset, not try to implement it, bolt it on after the fact. If you can incorporate security by design into the design of the products, into the design of the technology, I think it will be A, more effective, and B, ultimately cheaper in the long run. One of the things we're trying to do is create an IoT consortium. And this consortium is in partnership with a few other countries, Germany, if I recall, and I think the Dutch, and ourselves, and with industry players, companies who are heavily involved in the IoT space. Because as I said, they are the ones leading the R&D and more aware, more familiar with the technology than many governments. So I think this is absolutely the way to go. And the R&D space also involves academia, and we're actively engaging them as well.
Thank you. And David, when you answered that question, you also inadvertently answered one more question, which is up there, which said that David co-proposes for a rule-based order in cyberspace, and why this overwhelming thinking that there must be rules, regulation, control over the internet. David has clarified it has to be a collaborative approach as we go forward. But I think the last or the second question that's come up from one of the 2,800 locations across the world that are joining us live, I'm going to take on, but I already see a hand in the audience. Can we have the mic there, please? And can you please identify to whom you want to ask your specific question? Can we request the volunteer to please give the mic? And then we go on to the other question, because that's also a very pertinent question.
Thank you very much. My name is Harish Pillai. I'm from Singapore, and I'm also with the Internet Society Board of Trustees. So my question has got to do with how much of the multilateral work that you guys are doing or planning to do includes the engineers and the developers, the coders and people like that, because these are the guys who are building the technology, building whatever that needs to be done to make all of these things happen, instead of talking only on one side of the story, which is the legal, the social issues. What about the engineers, getting them involved, getting that as part of the conversation? So, for example, the Internet Engineering Task Force, IETF, there is a whole bunch of activities that's going on within IETF to make sure that IoT-related stuffs are addressed from a security perspective, IoT protocol for securing your IoT networks and what have you. So there's a lot of stuff that is also being done in parallel entities. So IETF is an example. So my question then is, how could GCCS collaborate with IETF and other international organizations from the software and developer perspective? So it is addressed to anybody who can choose to answer this. Thank you.
Excellent question. Anyone? Maybe Robert?
I just start. I couldn't agree more that we need to include the technical experts in any discussions that we're having. It should truly be multi-stakeholder and not multilateral discussions, and decisions should be made with multi-stakeholder input. So I think this venue can serve as a place where we're having multi-stakeholder discussions, but we can't come to an agreement unless we have a very robust engagement from the technical experts.
Does anyone else want to take this call? Okay, so I think it's very clear. There's an old Indian story. The story talks of 5 blind men trying to touch an elephant and trying to describe the elephant. So clearly, all of them, their intentions were noble, but each one of them described the elephant in a different manner altogether. So the learning in the context of cyberspace is that everybody and their perspectives are critical. If you think lawyers, lawmakers, policymakers alone would be helping decide the future of law and security in cyberspace, we are potentially mistaken. Why? Because the code writers, the engineers, the real building block makers have to be also made an integral part of this entire decision-making process. If there's no other question here, I want to come up to this fundamental question that's come up here on the screen from one of our remote locations. And I would ask all 3 panelists to answer this. And the question says, how GCCS will support cybersecurity law, their practice of cyber ecosystem in country-wise customizations? I think that's a very, very clever question. How will you actually adhere practices of cyber ecosystem in a country-wise customization? David, I would like to begin with you first. You are working on this new draft law in Singapore, and you have taken what Gandhiji's philosophy was. You know, Mahatma Gandhi, the father of India, had a philosophy. He said, I want to keep all the windows of my house open so that the breeze from all the 4 corners can come in and I can take the benefit of the same. And that's exactly what Singapore has done in its draft cybersecurity legislation. But over to you, David, what are your thoughts?
Thank you. Let me first begin by saying that cybersecurity is a multidisciplinary area. So it's not just an area for lawyers or engineers. I think that the previous question talked about involving engineers, coders, etc. in the work that we're doing. I think definitely, but on the flip side, it can't just be a technical issue. It is ultimately a multidisciplinary issue. It's a social issue, it's a legal issue, it's a psychological issue, and ultimately it's a global, international issue. So it has to involve all the different multidisciplinary areas in the conversation. In this context, Singapore has introduced a cybersecurity bill. It's in its draft stage now. We have just completed the public consultation. My agency is relatively new. It's 2.5 years old. We have been operating for the last 2.5 years without any law. So sometimes when I meet my counterparts, they ask me, how is the CSA operating if you do not have any legislation backing you up? And my response really is, for the last 2.5 years, we've been operating primarily on charm and good looks, trying to get people to do what we all know needs to be done. We have been using regulations and the force of moral suasion for them to incorporate cybersecurity measures in critical infrastructure, report when incidents happen, when sometimes their own instincts and their own incentives are not to report, and then ultimately to investigate and remediate when incidents take place. Now we are in the point where we think that there is a need for us to introduce a cybersecurity law. The objectives of the law really are to identify which industries are critical infrastructure that provide essential services to Singapore and Singaporeans. Next, to give them, identify the obligations that we place them under, primarily to report when incidents take place and to take appropriate cybersecurity precautionary measures. And third, for them to take direction from CSA when we have indications that an imminent attack is taking place. Next, it allows CSA to investigate when an incident has taken place. These altogether are, in a way, formalization of the existing processes and reporting operational processes that we have in place. And we have put it all together as a cybersecurity bill. It's being finished the public consultation and ultimately will be going to our parliament for approval. The second thing that our cybersecurity bill is introducing is an element of regulating the cyber industry. Cyber industry today is unregulated. We think that there is ultimately a need for us to have some measure of awareness of what's going on in the industry. We're starting with baby steps, very light legislation to look into two small aspects of the cybersecurity industry. One is managed security services, and the other one are penetration testers. Penetration testers are, for all intents and purposes, licensed hackers. Secondly, managed security services, you outsource your activities to them to manage. So we think that some measurement of licensing of who these people are, do you know who your employees are? Do they pass basic fit and proper standards? We're not regulating the standards of service that are provided. So these are two elements of the cybersecurity bill. We think they're essential because it levels up the overall environment in the country, in the area of provision of essential services. I think this is an essential first step. Thank you.
Thank you. Robert, would you want to add on your perspectives?
Yeah, I would say from a more philosophical perspective, as applies to any cybersecurity law, it's really important that we continue to foster competition and innovation. So we need to try to adopt standards that apply to the private sector that are light touch on the regulatory front, that are technology neutral, that ensure that the private sector is involved in setting the standards themselves so that we're getting a pathway to development that can continue to occur in the future in a variety of different ways, and it's not choosing just one technological path.
Sudan, do you want to say something?
Thank you. I'm convinced that it really truly goes both ways. Businesses have the fair right and view how they want to establish government intervention in what they do. Likewise, I think governments, and especially state-to-state cooperation, also has its kind of way of defining how they want to involve businesses in forming rules of behavior and norms. We all know that we need each other. I don't think it's going to be an easy way to find kind of, the path and also the threshold, how it's going to work. But it is not essentially something that we can do all together at every level. There are going to be always reserved functions for state-to-state cooperation in this. But for most of the game, I think businesses and also people who deal, with the technological side of it, there has to be an inclusion.
Thank you. By the way, this evening we are going to be seeing the unveiling of the Delhi Declaration, which is going to be the finale of the GCCS 2017, because this particular Delhi Declaration would potentially be talking about the various areas which different stakeholders have agreed upon to move forward in terms of positive, cogent action as we go towards contributing in making cyberspace more secure. We have one more question that's coming up from the remote location, and that's, do we require some specific security policies for Internet of Things ecosystem beyond the generalized security rules policies laid so far? That is a very interesting question. Does anyone in the panel, Robert, would you want to take it on? Do we think we need to distinguish between the normal cybersecurity versus IoT security, or it's one particular approach fits all?
As part of the United States' executive order on cybersecurity in May, one of the particular lines of effort is dealing with botnets, and botnets are driven by the Internet of Things. So we do think there's a particularized set of thought and approaches we need to have to address the IoT threats. How those standards are implemented, we would say would have to be should be done through international standards and with the development of the input of the private sector, but we do think you need to have a specialized approach.
Anyone else in the panel? David?
I don't think you need a separate set of rules for IoT, but I think you do need a different approach. And the reason is because a lot of the IoT devices are driven by functionality, and currently now the driving factor is the price point. So you're going for the lowest, cheapest capabilities. A lot of it don't come with security on board. Even if it comes with security, it's typically not upgraded, it's not patched, and ultimately the capabilities from the security perspective will lag behind. And then you get millions of devices which are unprotected and vulnerable. I think this represents a significant threat to the core infrastructure and botnets, like what Rob said earlier. So I think it does require a concerted view in how we should address this. Thank you.
Fantastic. So we've seen a variety of perspectives coming up and different questions coming up. I want to talk to ask my panelists one question that's in my mind and potentially in yours. If I was to ask each panelist to let us know what are the 5 things you would want the international community to do using law, using international cooperation to make cybersecurity more safe. Any 5, your wish list may not necessarily be happening, may be happening, each one their own. And I begin with you, Robert.
Great. Well, maybe I can only give you 2, but I think that we need to think more carefully about how we're adopting confidence-building measures between countries so that we can have better understandings with one another about roles and responsibilities in cyberspace to prevent miscalculation and escalation. So that's one. And I think in addition, we need to think about consequences for states that act outside the norms of responsible state behavior. There's a lot of thinking needs to go on in that area.
What about you, Sudan?
5 is way too many.
That would be 2, 3, okay. Your call.
To find an inclusive way so that, I'm talking about pretty much the UN level, so that more countries can contribute to this. As we know, this is a global issue and it's going to be increasingly global in the future. My second set would be a completely different level. Find ways of teaching cyber hygiene for a vast number of population that are already using the internet or that are about to use the internet, because these are actually the 2 extreme layers of cybersecurity and we can't do too much with, even with the most wonderful state-to-state cooperation, if billions of users have no idea what they are doing with their devices day by day.
David.
Okay, 5 is too many. I just have 3. First one is that we need to work together. There's a lot of things that we have in common. Let's look and focus on the things that we have in common and not on the things that separate, make us different. I think that's the first thing. The second one is that when I hear the global conversation going on, I think that there is a group of countries that are leading in the conversation, maybe about 50 countries who are aware and about very sophisticated in the conversation, but more than 100 countries who are just barely entering, aware of the situation. I think we need to focus on leveling the knowledge of these other countries up, level their knowledge up so that we can have greater convergence in our awareness and our thinking. And the third thing is let's aim for 80%. Let's move forward. Let's not aim and try to achieve 100%. I think that's really going to take far too long. We need to move forward. An 80% answer, 70% answer is good enough for a start.
Great. There are good action points that the panelists have talked about, but I think at the end of the day, it has to be cyber hygiene. Why? Because you as lawmakers, you as governors of the internet, can try to do all policies and all international cooperation to make cyberspace more secure. But if the young guy who's just getting on with the next new device is not even made aware of the basic norms, the chances are that he's potentially either going to be a victim or going to be an aggressor in terms of a cybercrime. I want to share a small story. My friend has a niece. The niece was born last January. When the niece was 4 months old, my friend's relatives, the father and mother of the 4-month-old girl, decided to give her a toy. What was the toy? An iPad mini. An iPad mini, duly connected to the internet, was given to this 4-month-old child. Mind you, the child has never ever spoken a single word in her life. By the time she was 6 months old, she was far more proficient of actually handling an iPad mini than even her parents. This is much before she has spoken the first word in her lifetime. And by the time she was 7 months old, she was shown a paper photograph of 20 years back. And what does the child do? The child starts doing this on the paper photograph, thinking that it's going to expand. So very clearly, we are going to be not only exposing our youngsters to these devices, their DNA is different, but we also need to sensitize them that they at least should be aware of the dangers of what lies in front of them as they go ahead using cyberspace. That's why I think when you talked about cyber hygiene, I completely endorse your thought process. I want to go a step further and say, how about countries trying to use cyber education, cyber law and cyber security education as an integral component of their school curriculum from the first standard onwards. Gone are the days where you're going to give them some gyan or awareness about cyber norms when they are 18 or 20. Today, children are far more intelligent, and they need to be appropriately sensitized in that regard. And ultimately, what David said, it's all about capacity building, it's all about collaboration, and at the end of the day, each one of us have to start contributing. As an age-old saying says, with each passing one drop, the vessel of water fills up. We all need to contribute in putting our respective drops in this entire ecosystem. Law is always slow, and history has been replete with examples that law can at best only provide a deterrence. It can never guarantee things. But when you have law and international cooperation together, I believe those are strong, cogent combinations that can help the global stakeholders make cyberspace far more secure, far more resilient, and a good place that we can actually leave for our children. At the end, I'd just like to conclude by saying, internet is a common heritage for the human mankind as a whole. We and our current generation have a responsibility for ensuring that this cyberspace remains secure, remains resilient, and a good heritage to hand on to the next generation. It's been lovely having you, all the 3 panelists with us this afternoon. Robert, Mr. Dan, David, thank you for joining us and your perspectives. And thank you to the audience for joining this very interesting session that we had. hopefully, we have learned something from our distinguished panelists, and I do hope that we all should start contributing in this particular direction of making cyberspace, our global heritage, far more secure and resilient. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you so much. So, thank you all the esteemed guest speakers. I would like to request Meenakshi Rai Bhatia to please come up onto the stage and present a memento to Mr. Pavan Duggal. Token of our respect. Jinu Rani Das Kele, Additional Secretary CCA. May I request you to please come up onto the stage and present a memento to respected Caroli Dan. Harsh Prabha, may I request you to join us here on the stage, and she's Scientist G, Ministry of Electronics and IT, to present mementos to Mr. David Ko and Mr. Rob Stair.
सिर्फ 3 बंदे हैं यहाँ ये देख रहे GCS लाइव चल रहा है
अब भी चल रहा है
हाँ ये 2 दिन आज का भी है
आज भी तेरी फोटो चल जाएगी
ये देख मैं वीडियो बंद करके
So thank you all the respected guest speakers for this session. Now we break for tea, and I request